my sound fixed now, so we'll jump in here and we're going to talk about chapter 10, talking about what's a monopoly. But before we get started on chapter 10, we're going to quickly go through what we learned in chapter 9, where we're talking about competitive markets, competition, pure competition. Won't spend a lot of time dwelling on it simply because the text does a pretty decent job, and I don't remember exactly what page it's on. When we get there, I'll mention the page number, but they do a pretty good job comparing a competitive market or a competitive model and a monopolistic model. So down toward the end of this chapter 10, again, the authors do a pretty good job on that. So when we get there, we'll kind of walk through the comparisons, and hopefully it'll give you at least a high-level summary of the comparisons between the two markets, or the comparisons between the two models. But again, when we talked about perfect competition, it's even though there are very few firms that meet the assumptions of perfect competition or pure competition, but it's a large number of buyers and sellers. It's everybody's all producers are generating a homogeneous product. Buyers and sellers have complete information, and there's easy entry and exit. And we talked in chapter 9 about why these assumptions either can or don't hold in the real world. And again, while they may not hold in the real world, it helps economists to simplify a very complex market or a very complex environment that we're working in. And one thing to also remember, that in the perfect competition model, buyers and sellers are what? They're price takers. Price takers. The price is set by the market. I think we talked about a bushel of corn. You have a bushel of corn, I have a bushel of corn, your neighbor has a bushel of corn, everybody in the county you live in has a bushel of corn. The market sets the spot price on that bushel of corn. You can go to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the Chicago Board of Trade, and get that spot price. And let's say the spot price is $6. It doesn't matter, how many bushels of corn I have to sell. I can sell it all at $6 a bushel because I am not a large enough producer to impact the market in any form or fashion. As I said, I don't have any Jack and the Beanstalk corn. So my corn's the same as your corn, the same as your neighbor's corn. Same thing with the stock market. Stock market flowing in and out with information, and the market setting the price. It sets the buy and sell price for General Electric, GM, for Starbucks, for Tesla. The market is setting the price for those goods and services in the competitive market. In the short run, the competitive market, where producers are concerned about two things: how much to produce and how to price the products. And again, the market's going to drive the price of those products. We touched briefly on total revenue. Total revenue is the market price times quantity. Profit is total revenue minus total cost. Perfectly competitive firm produces or sells product, or continues to produce and offer products to sell, until marginal revenue equals average revenue equals price. And again, price is externally set by the market. Economic profits and economic losses, we touched a little on that. And if there's an economic profit, you're going to have other firms enter the picture, and they're going to keep entering that picture as long as there's an economic profit. And at some point, you get a larger number of sellers generating more and more product, and it's going to compete or drive that market spot price down. And if it's an economic loss, in theory, you're going to have two things occur. You're either going to have individuals continue to produce, or you're going to have individuals or firms exit the market and shut down. And if the market price you have is greater than your average variable cost, you'll continue to produce and sell product because at least you're covering some level of your fixed cost. If the price is less than the average variable cost, you're going to shut down, because not only are you not covering your average variable cost, you're not covering any of your fixed costs. And then lastly, we talked about implicit versus explicit cost. And remember, the accountant looks at explicit costs. They're looking at total revenue minus total cost, and those are explicit. Those costs are generating an invoice. Those costs are having the company or the firm is having to pay out to cover those costs. If you're an economist, you're looking at total revenue minus explicit minus implicit cost, and the implicit costs are the proxy of the opportunity cost, or what would be the next best alternative to use those factors of production in the case of the firm. And then actually the last thing we touched on in that chapter were increasing cost versus decreasing cost versus constant cost industries. And the text does a pretty good job explaining those. So if you'd like to go back and touch base on those, don't hesitate. And then now we're going to talk about monopolies. And monopolies faced a downward sloping demand curve alone. Monopoly means there's only one seller, one producer in the market, and that demand curve is downward sloping for them. And they have the market power, and they have control over the price. They produce smaller quantity and charge a higher price. I mean, that's great. Higher price, smaller quantity. Inefficient from society's perspective, because a lot of times they're not going to be generating at a level or producing at a level where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And the governments try, in some cases, to regulate monopolies to ensure that they are not overcharging or significantly overcharging the consuming population. And the nature of monopolies, if we go back to our competitive firms, remember, competitive firms are generating goods and services where economic profits are equal to zero. On the other hand, a monopolist is a firm that is the only producer of a good or service for which there are no close substitutes. Remember, no close substitutes, and for which entry by potential rivals is prohibitively difficult. And we'll get into market power, barriers to entry in a few minutes. But those are, if you go back to the textbook, that's the definition that they provide for either a monopoly or a monopolist. Only game in town, generating a good or service in which there are no close substitutes. And lastly, through barriers to entry, they can be natural or they can be artificial barriers to entry. They don't have to worry about rivals. They don't have to worry about competition. Monopoly is an industry in which a single firm is the only producer of a good or service for which there are no close substitutes, and for which entry by possible rivals is prohibitively difficult. So again, the textbook has the same definition or very similar definition for a monopolist, the individual that owns a monopoly, and monopoly, the firm or the entity that's generating these goods or services. Remember, we talked about the characteristics of a competitive firm, and among those characteristics, again, large number of buyers and sellers, homogeneous product, easy entry and exit. And so those are just some of the kind of the nuances that we talked about on the competitive market. And if you talk about a monopoly, the characteristics, so one seller in the industry, no rivals. Product is unique, no close substitutes. Substantial barriers to entry, lock out potential competition. So remember, if you just compare the monopoly to the competitive market, at that point, many goods and many buyers and sellers, one seller. Homogeneous product, unique product. easy entry, easy exit, difficult to enter in the monopoly, in a monopolist or a monopoly market. So those, if you just take those three, the big three, and compare them, you can see quickly that there is a substantial difference between a competitive market and a monopolistic market or a monopoly market. The monopolist has the market all to himself or herself. Market demand, the seller's firm is the market demand. Only one firm in the market. It's not like perfect competition where there are multiple buyers and multiple sellers. So with multiple buyers, you're going to have adding across the buyers to get that market demand. With a monopoly, there's only one. There's only one seller. So and at that point, you have a whatever the seller's firm demand is, that is also the market demand. And so you end up with that downward sloping demand curve. The monopolist selects the price and quantity to maximize his or her profits. Doesn't have to worry about anybody else. Sets the profit maximizing quantity and the profit maximizing price, and they're off to the races. Short run profits are sustainable into the long run. Because of why? Because there's no competition, no barrier, there are barriers to entry. Competition is eliminated. They are definitely a price setter. A firm that sets or picks the price based on whatever their output decision is. And here is a really defining aspect of a monopoly, is the market power. The ability to act as a price setter. They have pricing power, and pricing power is monopoly power. So keep in mind, the monopolist sets the level of output and they set the price. Perfect competition, the market sets the price. Perfect competition, you can sell as many units of a good or service as you want to at that market price because you can't impact the market. The monopolist, because the firm is the market, they are going to drive not only the output, but they're going to drive the price. And in that case, it may not be maximizing the net benefit to society. I think we're going to stop there for a few minutes. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some sources of monopoly power. Talk to everybody in a few minutes.